All right, let's dive into this Austrian economics thing. You sent over Man, Economy, and State by Murray Rothbard. And wow, I gotta say, I'm hooked already. It's definitely dense, yeah, but Rothbard's approach is just, it clicks, you know? He seems to be getting at, like, how we actually make decisions in the real world, not just some theoretical, you know, that.
Vacuum. Yeah, he uses this thing called praxeology. It sounds kind of intimidating at first, but really it's just the study of human action and its consequences. So it's not so much about like complex equations and models. It's more about understanding that we all have goals and we make choices to try and achieve them.
Right, so instead of these abstract models, it starts with, like, the individual person.
Exactly. And that leads to some interesting conclusions. For example, one of the core ideas of Austrian economics is subjective value.
Ooh, this is something that really hit me. I always thought that value was just, like, inherent in things, you know? Like, gold is valuable because it's rare. But Rothbard argues that value is actually determined by our individual preferences.
Yeah. He used a really good example. It's Robinson Crusoe on his deserted island. And he's trying to decide, should he spend his time picking berries or relaxing on the beach? And the value that he puts on each of those activities changes depending on how hungry he is or how much leisure he's had.
So if he's starving, those berries are going to be super valuable. But once he's full, not so much.
Precisely. And it's the same for us in our daily lives. Why did you choose your current phone plan over other options? Or why do you spend your weekend reading a book instead of going to a concert? It all comes down to what you want and need right now.
It's so simple, but it changes everything, right? I mean, for how we think about economics.
Absolutely. Value isn't objective. It's not fixed.
Yeah.
It's fluid. And it's constantly changing based on what individuals prefer.
So how does this idea of subjective value play out in the larger economy? Rothbard talks about the structure of production. And I gotta admit, that's where I started, to get a little lost.
Well, think of it like a journey. Every step along the way adds value. You start with raw materials, things like timber or iron ore, and then through various stages, they get transformed. First into intermediate goods, lumber, steel, and finally, finished goods, like a house or a car.
It's like a chain reaction. Each link is a stage of production, adding value to the final product.
Exactly. And this whole process takes time.
Yeah.
And that's where time preference becomes really important. The further away a good is from being ready to consume, the less we value it right now.
Yeah, we're impatient. We want stuff now, not later.
Right. And that's reflected in the interest rate. People who save money, they're delaying gratification. And they make those savings available for investment. They expect a return because they're giving up consumption today for the promise of consumption tomorrow.
So capitalists, the people who provide the money, they're bridging that gap. They're taking on the risk that those future goods will actually be worth something.
Exactly. And they're rewarded for that risk with interest. It's not about exploiting anyone. It's just a fundamental part of human nature. We just value things more when we can have them now.
Okay. Rothbard also talks a lot about the role of the entrepreneur. I've always thought of them as, you know, the risk takers, the people who start businesses.
Oh, they're definitely risk takers.
Yeah.
But it's more than that. They're the ones who are trying to figure out what people will want in the future and then how to provide it. They're always innovating, trying to find new and better ways to do things.
That sounds really challenging, always dealing with so much uncertainty. How do they even know if their ideas will work?
Well, that's where the market comes in. It's a profit and loss system. If entrepreneurs are right and they create something people want, they profit. If they're wrong, they lose.
It's like a constant feedback loop, rewarding success and punishing failure. And this brings us to consumer sovereignty.
Yeah, that's the idea, that in a free market, producers are ultimately guided by consumer demand. They don't dictate what people should want. They respond to what people are actually willing to pay for.
But this doesn't mean that producers are like slaves to every consumer whim, right?
Not at all. They're still free to choose what to produce and how to produce it. It's about finding a balance between what they're good at and what they think will sell.
It's fascinating how these simple ideas, subjective value, time preference, consumer sovereignty, can explain how the whole economy works. And we're just getting started. Rothbard goes on to explore how money develops, problems with monopoly, so much more.
And each topic builds on the last, and it gives you a deeper understanding of how markets really work and the role of choice and freedom in creating a prosperous society.
Before we jump into all that, let's take a quick break. When we come back, we'll look at how money emerges from barter and why Rothbard is so skeptical of fractional reserve banking.
That's good.
So we've talked about value being subjective and how that affects, production and the role of capitalists and all that. But what about money? Where does that even come from?
It's a really cool process, actually. Think about a world with no money. Everyone just bartering goods and services. It'd be so inefficient. Like, how many chickens would you have to trade to get, like, a new laptop?
Oh, man, total nightmare.
Right. So money emerges naturally from that barter system as people look for a more efficient way to trade. Certain commodities, things like gold or silver, become more widely desired. They're durable, they're divisible, and they're relatively scarce.
They become like a medium of exchange, making trading much easier.
Exactly. And over time,
Right.
one commodity usually becomes the most popular, the most widely accepted, and that becomes what we think of as money.
That makes sense. But Rothbard seems kind of skeptical of fractional reserve banking, which is how our system works now. What's his problem with that?
He sees it as a form of counterfeiting.
Yeah.
Basically, creating money out of thin air. When banks only keep a fraction of deposits in reserve and lend out the rest, they're increasing the money supply without any real increase in savings.
So it's like fake wealth, not backed by anything real.
Exactly. And this can lead to all kinds of issues. Inflation, asset bubbles, economic instability. Rothbard argues a sound monetary system should be based on something like gold, something that can't be messed with by governments or central banks.
I see how it all ties together now. Subjective value, time preference, sound money, it all points to individual choice and limiting government interference in the economy. But Rothbard doesn't stop there. He also gets into monopolies. Most people think monopolies are bad for consumers, but he has a different take.
He makes a distinction between free market monopolies and government-granted monopolies. In a truly free market, it's really hard to keep a monopoly going for very long.
Really? Why is that? Seems like if a company is big and powerful enough, it could just crush the competition.
Well, the desire for profit actually works against that. High profits attract new companies into the market, and those new competitors will try to undercut the monopolist. They'll offer similar stuff at lower prices.
So competition keeps monopolies in check.
Exactly. It's a self-correcting mechanism in a free market. But when the government gets involved and gives special privileges to some companies, like patents or exclusive licenses, that's when you get real monopolies that stick around.
And those can hurt consumers.
Right.
Because they don't have to compete as much.
Right. They can get away with charging more for lower quality stuff because consumers don't have other options.
That makes sense. So for Rothbard, the real threat isn't competition, it's the government interfering.
Right.
But how does this all relate to entrepreneurs? Those risk takers we were talking about earlier.
The entrepreneur is a key part of this whole thing.
Yeah.
They're always trying to push the boundaries, trying to figure out what consumers will want, and finding creative ways to give it to them. They're the engine of economic growth and progress.
But it's risky, isn't it?
Oh, definitely. Entrepreneurship is all about uncertainty, making decisions with incomplete information. But that's what makes it so important. They're always experimenting, trying new things. And of course, some of those experiments will fail.
So failure is important too.
Absolutely. It's how the market learns and adapts. When something fails, it tells other entrepreneurs, okay, that path isn't going to work. And it frees up resources to be used elsewhere.
Like a constant process of trial and error.
Exactly. And this process, while not perfect, is much more efficient and dynamic than any centrally planned system.
So we're starting to see Rothbard's view. The free market is a complex system, but it can regulate itself. It works best when the government stays out of it. He emphasizes individual choice and responsibility.
He sees individuals as the driving force. Their choices and preferences shape everything. He believes a sound monetary system, backed by gold, is essential for a stable economy.
And entrepreneurs are like the heroes, the ones pushing things forward. But it's not just about ambition. Rothbard also talks about capital accumulation, which needs savings. And capitalists play a big part there.
They provide those savings. They're the bridge between consumption now and later. It's a really interesting interplay of actions and motivations, coordinated by the market.
It's a complex perspective that challenges a lot of conventional wisdom. But let's take a step back for a second and think about some of the criticisms of Austrian economics.
It's important to recognize that every economic theory has its critics, and the Austrian school is no different. Some people argue that it's too abstract, too focused on theoretical models, not enough on real-world data.
Okay, that's interesting. We'll get into those criticisms and explore the strengths and weaknesses of the Austrian school next time.
Okay, so we left off talking about some of the criticisms of Austrian economics. Like you said, every theory has its critics. What are some of the main things people bring up?
Well, one common one is that it's too abstract, too focused on, like, logical deductions, and not enough on real-world data. Yeah, I can see that. It does feel very focused on principles, and less on, like, number crunching, or trying to predict what's going to happen.
Right, Austrian economists. They really value logical reasoning and understanding those underlying principles. They believe that economic truths come from how people act, which you can figure out
Yeah.
through logic and reason, not just by looking at data.
So it's more about understanding the why behind what's going on, rather than trying to forecast, like, what's going to happen next week.
Exactly. They believe that it's almost impossible to accurately quantify and predict everything that's going to happen in the economy because it involves so many individuals making choices based on their own unique situations.
That makes sense. I mean, the economy is super complex. People are unpredictable. But doesn't that make it hard to, like, test Austrian theories?
It does present a challenge.
Yeah.
And that's where some of the criticism comes from. But proponents would say that this focus on first principles leads to a deeper understanding of how things really work.
Like understanding the laws of physics. You don't need to measure the speed of every single falling apple to understand gravity.
That's a great analogy. Another criticism you hear is that Austrian economics is too ideological, more about promoting free markets and limited government than objective analysis.
I can see that. Rothbard is definitely a big advocate for free markets.
It's true that Austrian economists tend to favor free markets, but they say that comes from their analysis of how markets actually work, not from some pre-existing bias.
It's not just blind faith in free markets.
Right. They believe, based on their analysis, that free markets are the most efficient way and the most morally sound way to organize economic activity.
They see government intervention as leading to problems, unintended consequences, ultimately more harm than good.
Exactly. They see the market as a self-regulating system that can adapt much better than any government could.
Of course. This is a big debate. There are plenty of economists who think government intervention is necessary to deal with things like market failures, inequality, social safety nets.
It's an important debate with valid points on both sides. But the Austrian school makes us think critically about what the government should be doing and consider the potential downsides of its involvement.
It reminds us that governments aren't perfect. They're made up of people who might have their own agendas.
Exactly. Austrian economics reminds us to be aware of unintended consequences, to recognize that governments have limits, and to appreciate the power of the free market.
It's a call for humility in terms of what we can know about something as complex as the economy and what we can realistically expect from government.
It's a reminder that solutions often come from individual initiative, innovation, and cooperation within a free market, not from top-down control.
Well, this has been a fascinating dive into Austrian economics and Murray Rothbard's Man, Economy, and State. It's given me a lot to think about. What are some key takeaways you hope our listeners will get from this?
First, I hope they understand that value is subjective. It comes from individual preferences, and that has huge implications for how we think about markets.
It really challenges the idea that there's some objective measure of value.
Yeah. Second, I hope they understand the importance of time preference in economics. It explains why interest rates exist, why saving and investment are so crucial, and how the market coordinates consumption over time.
It makes you realize every economic decision involves a trade-off between what we want now and planning for the future.
Exactly. And finally, I hope they see the Austrian school, not as just a bunch of theories, but as a way of thinking about economics that puts emphasis on human action, individual choice, and the limits of government.
It's a perspective that makes us question our assumptions about the role of government and appreciate the power of free markets to create a better society.
It encourages us to look at the world differently, to value individual liberty, and recognize the potential of human ingenuity and cooperation in a free society.
Well said. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been a really insightful conversation. And to our listeners, we encourage you to keep exploring the world of Austrian economics. There's always more to learn.